Welcome to St. Elizabeth University. I am Dr. Rich Quinlan, the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education, and welcome to the first of our book talks with an esteemed author, Rebecca Brender-Graham. She is the author of Dear Miss Perkins, which is the story of Frances Perkins and her efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany in an effort to try to bring them to the United States. So, hello, Rebecca. It is an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quinlan, for inviting me.
Oh, please call me Rich. I'm barely Dr. Quinlan. But we are thrilled to have you because this is just an astounding book, and a book about someone who I think has deserved more attention in Frances Perkins. For people who don't know, she's the only woman who was within Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, and correct me if I'm wrong, also the longest serving Secretary of Labor. Is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome.
She was in the Department of Labor for 12 years.
Wow. Well, let's start to dive into the book a little bit. Let's start with a little bit about how it actually came to be. You attended, like Frances Perkins, who attended Mount Holyoke College, and initially this began as your senior thesis, correct?
Frances Perkins and I don't have that much in common. I think if she were on your podcast, you might get less information out of her than you will from me today. But we did both attend Mount Holyoke College. And Frances Perkins was very proud of Mount Holyoke. Mount Holyoke was very proud of Frances Perkins. And I got very lucky that during my senior year, there was an internship specifically for a Mount Holyoke student that was with the Frances Perkins Center, which is the institutional home for the Frances Perkins legacy in Maine. The internship was based in Washington, D.C. because it was to organize the research of Kirsten Downey, author of The Woman Behind the New Deal, which was the biography that came out in 2009. Again, this internship was specifically for a Mount Holyoke student, so I organized her research over the summer. And while I was doing that in her house, Kirsten was having her kitchen redone, and she would stop by and chat and tell me, I think her biography that she published was like a third of the length of the original manuscript. Like, there was a lot that got cut. So she told me about the letters that Frances Perkins received on behalf of refugees from Nazi Germany that are housed in the National Archives at College Park. So in the very last week of my internship, this is summer 2014, over a decade ago, I got to go see the letters for myself. Kirsten told me that when you see the Baron von Trapp's business card, you know you're in the right place. And I did. And then it became the archival backbone of my undergraduate thesis. The thesis itself, there were 3 chapters. One was about charge bonds, one was about visas, and the third was about the transfer of the INS. Of course, the book has 13 chapters, so I really did bear out the details, but actually the title and the argument stayed relatively the same.
Now, by the way, just out of curiosity, were you able to find out what kind of student Frances Perkins was when she was at Mount Holyoke? Mm-hmm. How was she? Was she good? Strong student?
Well, it depends how you define student. She did not have straight A's.
Okay.
There was one assignment that she turned in, and her handwriting was so messy that the professor refused to grade it. She did do her homework, like when there was an assignment to visit the mills of Holyoke, Massachusetts, and report back about labor conditions. She did that, and it was a formative moment for her. She actually majored in chemistry and physics, and she did that because she liked the challenge. According to my definition as a teacher, Frances Perkins was an excellent student because she really brought something from to the table, and she was a relatively unique and interesting person. But she was not your cookie cutter, dot your I's, cross your T's type of student.
So as you're doing this research and you're delving into her life as an undergrad, how does a graduate thesis eventually evolve into a book?
My undergraduate thesis. So my graduate dissertation was on Sunday mail delivery in the 19th century as
That's right. So
lens into religion-state relations.
So
but basically, I applied to graduate school, and I didn't tell people this for years, but I actually applied for multiple topics. I applied to some programs with early American history, and I applied to some programs with the Frances Perkins topic. I did not get into any programs for the Frances Perkins topic. Graduate theses tend not to emphasize an individual, whereas the The book publishing market is more interested in individuals' story with something. Um, but Frances Perkins kind of stayed with me the whole time because I had learned a lot about American history through her perspective. I remember when I took the Introduction to Historiography course in my first semester of graduate school, which was now 10 years ago, fall semester 2015, I used to flip to the index and look for Frances Perkins, and then I would focus my response on wherever she was. She was in the index of a lot of the books. I mean, a pretty standard first semester history graduate school book is Impossible Subjects by May Nye, which is about American immigration history. Frances Perkins is all over that, although my book is the first book-length treatment of Frances Perkins's immigration policy.
There are a couple of themes that you return to very often in the book. The word xenophobia pops up a lot, as well as just Frances Perkins' placement within what was very much a man's world of politics at that time, the only woman in the midst of this cabinet. You know, sometimes when people think about America's lack of action in terms of the refugee crisis, people point at FDR, and Roosevelt takes a lot of the blame. But could you sort of expand upon a little bit about just sort of the tone of the country and the nature of that cabinet and sort of the political environment in which Roosevelt was functioning, as well as Frances Perkins, that made it so difficult to bring immigrants into America at that time, or refugees specifically?
Xenophobia was pervasive. Frances Perkins's lifetime was 1880 to 1965, and in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act set precedent for excluding people based on their nationality, and that didn't end until the 1924 quota system was abolished in 1965. In 1924, the National Origins Act set up quotas from every country where the U.S. accepted immigrants from and set the number of people that could immigrate from each country based on pseudoscientific racist data and the census, because xenophobic lawmakers in Congress wanted to exponentially increase the demographics that they wanted to be Americans. That was the law on the books throughout the German Jewish refugee crisis. But really, the period where American immigration law discriminated explicitly based on ethnicity and nationality was Frances Perkins's lifetime. And throughout her lifetime, she was often a public servant, and even before she was an appointed official, she worked with immigrant communities at settlement homes. And then when she was in Roosevelt's cabinet, you asked about, like, where does the blame go? I don't know. The question of blame is not really one that interests me. I'm more interested in social forces and structures. Congress makes laws. The American people elect Congress and the president. The executive branch implements laws. And political scientists have done work on the extent to which the executive branch has played more of a hand in immigration over the course of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Now it's much more than it was then. But the Immigration Naturalization Service was in her cabinet department from 1933 to 1940, and that's why those are the years of my book. She actually asked the president for an executive order to combine the Immigration Bureau with the Naturalization Bureau. She did that to consolidate her authority so that she may reform the system, which had been running on xenophobia during the Hoover administration.
How much impact would you say that the Great Depression had upon that, a willingness of Americans to accept new refugees, new people into the country?
Well, in terms of the German Jewish refugee crisis, the global economic crisis had a detrimental effect on the Jewish population of Germany because it motivated people who had nothing to vote for the Nazi Party, and then they would take everything from the Jewish population. So, I mean, the story in my book wouldn't have happened without the global economic downturn. In the United States, in the letters, in the hate mail, in the rhetoric, the scarcity of resources is a frequent topic of discussion. There's a note that I cite in the introduction of my book. It's a piece of hate mail that the head of the Children's Bureau received in 1939, and it's from a rat catcher in Boston named Walter Campbell, and he says that he's seen children on the streets starving, and why would we accept child refugees if there are children on the streets starving? And on one hand, you might understand the urgency of children on the streets starving, but then conveniently for historical interpretation, he ends with, P.S. Are you funded by the rich Jews?
So that's a perfect lead-in to the next couple of questions, because one, we have to address the issue of anti-Semitism during this time. I mean, you had individuals within the administration like Breckinridge Long who celebrated Mein Kampf and talked about Jews as war agitators. So within, once again, the political atmosphere of both Washington, D.C. and the broader America, how pervasive was anti-Semitism? How public was it? How accepted was it around this time?
Anti-Semitism is another form of othering. Within the context of my book, it's one of the flavors of xenophobia, fear of other, and it was normal. It was pretty normal. There's a letter that Frances Perkins sends in 1903 where she's writing into her college class, and she says that she's substitute teaching and she has Italian immigrant children and Jewish immigrant children, and she writes, you can imagine how that would be. She doesn't mean that in a sinister way, but they're other to her, and they're other to most of the people who are at the upper echelons of American society. Gradually that was changing, and some of the people she worked directly with were Jewish and represented Jewish communities. For example, Charles Wyzanski was her solicitor of labor. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He was 27 years old in 1933, and he was Jewish, and his family was German Jewish. And he warned her that if they accepted an influx of German Jewish refugees, that could be bad for Jewish Americans. He was not advocating against them. He did a lot of work in support of immigration, but it was a real factor that was a concern all the time.
And you mentioned a few moments ago about the suffering of children. And very famously, there was the Wagner-Rogers bill that would have brought in roughly 20,000 children who were 14 and under. Now, why did that, you do reference a senator in your book by the name of Robert Reynolds, who may not be a particularly well-known figure, but could you talk a little bit about who he was and what he did to try to block this bill that would have allowed children to gain safe refuge in America?
The bill's origins, you could say, were in the child refugee program that Perkins worked on beginning in 1934. But then in November 1938, after Kristallnacht, there was suddenly increased attention to the refugee crisis from the public, and there was slightly increased sympathy. So a lot of options were pursued then that were not pursued at another time. And if they had a chance of passage, they would have passed then. And one of them was the Wagner-Rogers bill that went to committee in the summer of 1939. And there was a lot of public attention, like people from Hollywood did radio programs about it. There was a lot of mail that Perkins's office and others that she worked with received about it. It just received a lot more attention. And the bill did not make it to a floor vote in Congress. It was killed in committee, and it was killed because the person you mentioned, Senator Reynolds, his background was anti-immigrant. I don't remember the details of the story. There was a newspaper that he supported in his home district that was vehemently anti-Semitic. I don't remember the details. But he said to Senator Robert Wagner of Wagner-Rogers, he told him that you can have your child refugees if we end all adult immigration. And Wagner was not willing to do that. He said if we are only letting in children, that would be a death sentence to the Jewish adults. And so he pulled the bill, not because he wanted to pull the bill, but because politically it was getting worse.
One of the most fascinating stories in your book, and you go into detail with it so wonderfully, and I think so few people know about this, was an idea that Perkins had that she was working on that involved Alaska, which was, of course, not yet an American state at that time, still a territory. But what was her plan that connected refugees and Alaska?
This was another idea that came out of that November 1938 moment, or so I thought. When I was researching the book, I found a letter thanks to the University of Alaska at Fairbanks Library that they sent me digitized, and it was Perkins corresponding with a bishop in Alaska in 1935. It was not specifically about Jewish refugees, but basically he told her that white people, and not in these words, but he said that white people in Alaska wanted more white people there. Of course, the language in the primary source was more about development, imperialist words. And you could see, so Perkins then sent a note in her own scribble handwriting to the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. And the wheels were clearly spinning to maybe bring refugees there. It was one of the many ideas that she had. She was not a central character in the story of the Alaska bill that unfolded. So after Kristallnacht, after the Wagner-Rogers bill, after it became clear that the U.S. would not add child refugees to the quotas, so then they started the idea of, when I say they, I mean the pro-immigrant lawmakers, they wanted a quota somewhere else, and they looked to the American colonized territory of Alaska. So by the time that bill was in committee in 1940, a lot more had happened. Perkins had lost some political capital. Also, World War II had started in Europe. So there were just many more considerations by that point, and I think it's fair to say that the King-Havner bill stood less of a chance than the Wagner-Rogers bill had before it. It had less public support.
So how close did we actually come to establishing a refugee colony, if you will, for lack of a better term, in Alaska? Was it something that was just more theoretical than actually practical, or was this really taken seriously?
Real people put a lot of work into it. There was a man named Felix Cohen who he was actually like a really influential attorney at the Department of the Interior, and he produced a report. And because of the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism, they didn't call it the Cohen Report, they called it the Slattery Report, which was someone else who worked for Harold Ickes. But the Department of the Interior in 1940 spun a lot of wheels on this. That doesn't mean that it ever had a chance of happening, but real people spent weeks researching. They had a whole plan. They were not going to let the refugees step foot in the mainland. They were going to make sure that they had a certain percentage of people who were not Jewish, who were refugees coming. They jumped through a lot of hoops. I don't think that there was a hoop to jump through for this actually to happen. And there were many political actors involved, and really the only people who were interested were the direct advocates for Jewish refugees and the Jewish refugees themselves.
It's amazing to think that Alaska and the Dominican Republic actually shared a similarity there when you mentioned that letter talking about trying to bring more white people into Alaska. And of course, Trujillo accepted roughly 70,000 Jewish refugees into the DR specifically because he wanted to whiten his population. I mean, most people would not put Alaska and the Dominican Republic in the same conversation very much, but you see just sort of the complexity of the time.
And it's important to remember that anti-Semitism was racialized in Nazi Germany, but when I was writing this book, I was teaching a class at American University called Social Forces That Changed America, and different social forces can intersect with each other. But I always tried to keep anti-Semitism separate from racism. Anti-Semitism is older than colorist racism, and both things can be true. There can be anti-Semitism that kicks Jewish refugees out of Nazi territory, and then there can also be white supremacy that can welcome Jewish refugees who can pass as white into places that run on white supremacy, and the United States has been one of those.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned your book goes up to 1940, and you mentioned by that time that unfortunately Perkins had lost a little bit of her political capital and influence because one of the things that happened to her was there was an attempted impeachment. And usually we think impeachment with presidents, maybe not members of cabinet or members of the presidential cabinet, but why were people trying to impeach Frances Perkins, and who was behind that impeachment?
This was one of the questions I had when transitioning from my undergraduate thesis to the book, because I thought that it was about immigration. Here's what actually happened. In 1920, a man named Harry Bridges moved from Australia to California. In 1932, he became spokesman for the dock workers in their union on the West Coast. In 1934, he led a massive strike called the Longshore Strike, which achieved shorter hours, better pay, and safer working conditions. And it did not receive significant national attention until the following year, when one of the pieces of New Deal legislation that Frances Perkins worked on, the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, it provided a legal mechanism for strikes, unions, and collective bargaining. And that was when there was significant backlash against Harry Bridges. And the anti-union people, the anti-New Deal people, they wanted Harry Bridges deported, and they wanted Frances Perkins impeached for not deporting him. And they knew that she was both at the helm of the INS and also that she had been a central figure in the creation of the Wagner Act. It was on her initial list of priorities for the administration, and she worked directly with Senator Wagner on it. So then the anti-New Dealers wanted her impeached. But that was in 1935. It took a couple years for it to snowball. There were rumors that there was a massive conspiracy theory that that Frances Perkins was a Russian Jewish immigrant. She was born a Congregationalist in Boston, but the bigots wanted to be able to use anti-Semitism against her, and it snowballed. And then there was a resolution to impeach her in early 1939, and she actually had to sit through testimony in the U.S. House of Representatives. She brought with her Solicitor of Labor by that point was Jerry Riley, and also her Commissioner of Immigration, James, I never know how to pronounce his last name. My audiobook narrator says Hodling. Yeah. You said something else earlier today.
Yeah, I've heard it pronounced Houtling.
In my head, it's always been Hoftelling, which I'm sure is incorrect, and I've been studying this since college, and there are probably lots of words that I pronounce
It's all the same guys.
I read it in the archives. So they went with her, and she was not impeached. Mm-hmm. There was no legal grounds to impeach Frances Perkins on the grounds of treason, which was the charge, because her opponents, they equated unions with communism, and they created communism they equated it with overthrowing the government, and that was how they got to the charge of treason. But there were no grounds to impeach her. Unfortunately, the optics of sitting through the resolution to impeach her on a case that did relate to immigration rendered her relatively politically useless on the issue of immigration. So then she did not testify in the Wagner-Rogers hearings later that year, because it would have been worse for the bill if she put her face on it.
Would you say that there was also underlying, or quite possibly more overt, sexism that was involved in the targeting of Perkins?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
It's nearly impossible to measure.
Mm-hmm. She
was always a woman. She was never not a woman. I guess the clearest example is the hate mail that she received that I go through in the impeachment chapter. They said They always messed up her name intentionally. She chose to go by Frances Perkins. Her husband's name was Paul Wilson. Her gravestone actually says Frances Perkins Wilson. I wrote an essay about this for Ms. Magazine because she went by so many names, and it was always gender politics. But people would address her as Mrs. triple question mark Paul Wilson, just like a ton of sexist remarks in this hate mail. So again, it's difficult to measure how much she was targeted because she was a woman, yet we know for sure it was always a factor. I think my ultimate opinion on this is it was always sexism, and it was always also other factors. It was never just sexism.
Well, what's interesting about your book, one of the many aspects of it that's interesting, is that while you certainly lay out in great detail the challenges, the struggles, the obstacles that Frances Perkins faced, there also seems to be a theme in which you believe that a singular person can really make a difference in government. I'm wondering if you still feel that way. Has America moved in a direction where a Frances Perkins, if she was with us today, would she have the same kind of impact, do you think?
Dear Miss Perkins is a story of individual and collective action. She was an individual. She came in with policies that she wanted to see to reform structures. But there were also embedded structures that were in her way when she was trying to make an individual difference. So there's this constant interplay between the individual and the collective. That's the kind of probably too academic answer. And then my book came out the day after the presidential inauguration in 2025, and I was doing my publication week launch in Washington, D.C. And someone asked me a question about, like, what would Frances Perkins do today? And what I had prepared was the jargony individualist versus collectivist answer, which I truly do believe. Like, I think that's interesting how it's a delicate interplay. But what came out of my mouth during that launch week in D.C. was that in this book, no one person is doing all the action, but each person is doing what they can do. So Frances Perkins was extraordinary at taking ideas from outside of the establishment and helping to encode them into law, mostly on other policies, not on refugee policy. But she was an institutionalist who worked within the system to reform the system. In my book, Cecilia Rozovsky is a Jewish activist, especially on child refugee policy, and she canvassed Jewish communities, and she built coalitions, and she personally kept in touch with these child refugees who came. She was a community activist. She was never elected or appointed to a government position, but she got so much done. And then you have Dorothy Thompson, who's the journalist who covered the rise of the Nazi Party in Berlin, and then she got kicked out by Hitler in 1934, and then she continues to write a ton in the U.S. and help to educate the public. She writes to Perkins. I have a few examples in the Dear Miss Perkins chapter where Dorothy Thompson is writing to her on behalf of a refugee that she's met. She's using her words. That's what she does. Dorothy Thompson has a lot to say. She has a lot to say. Most of the time, it's accurate. And who else is there? I know I'm forgetting to mention one, probably more than one important person. I mean, Franklin D. Roosevelt is President of the United States, and he's an extraordinary politician. He thinks politically. He organizes politically. And that was the role that he played. So what I still believe is that each person can do what they're good at doing, and no one can do everything.
Did Frances Perkins have much connection, conversation, interaction with Eleanor Roosevelt? Because Eleanor was very outspoken, for example, in favor of the Wagner-Rogers bill.
Yes, that was the first bill that Eleanor Roosevelt endorsed publicly. Frances Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt had nearly identical political priorities. They had a good working relationship with each other. Eleanor and Franklin did not really have the same social circles, and Frances Perkins was more in Franklin D. Roosevelt's social circle. She was a trusted workplace confidant of Franklin Roosevelt. I think that someone should write a book about the different career trajectories of Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt, because Frances Perkins was born into a pretty privileged childhood. She became a working person because her husband fell ill and could not support the family. Whereas Eleanor Roosevelt had a pretty difficult childhood. Her father died young of, I think, some combination of alcoholism and mental health struggles. And Eleanor Roosevelt came into a position of influence by marrying arguably the most charismatic political figure of the 20th century. So they got to their positions very differently. Of course, Frances Perkins was appointed. It was a full-time job. Eleanor Roosevelt was First Lady, and she helped to transform that role into something that could exert real political influence. But by the end of the administration, Eleanor Roosevelt was left with her political capital intact. Frances Perkins was not. And I think that that speaks to how Americans at the time, and a little bit still, were more comfortable with someone coming into influence through her husband than through her own work.
That's fascinating. And you're right, that would be an amazing book, because Eleanor just completely transcended what any previous First Lady had done. So, yeah, that would be a really fascinating discussion. So, to kind of just wrap up with a couple of more questions about the actual writing of the text. You intersperse a number of letters from refugees. You've mentioned hate mail. Why the choice to do that instead of sort of your kind of traditional biographical piece? What did the inclusion of the letters mean to you, and how do you think they shape your book?
Dear Miss Perkins is marketed as a biography. I did not see it that way while writing it. I'm not opposed to marketing it that way. And if readers of biography like it, I'm thrilled. But I always saw it as telling a story that takes place at the intersection of Frances Perkins, American immigration law, and American responses to Nazi Germany. And so whatever seemed right for me to tell that story is what made it into the book.
Now, again, you have a Mount Holyoke connection with her. You went through all of this, all of her letters. You learned what kind of student she was. You sort of know Frances Perkins in a way, in a way that's far more complete than most other people. Is there anything you learned that truly caught you by surprise about her?
You know how you can be not surprised by something, but still like kind of shocked by it? The extent to which she did not draw attention to herself is always staggering. So child refugee policy is inherently tragic, right? But it was one of the more successful policies that she advanced in the story that I'm telling, and she instructed the press not to cover it. And everyone listened except for one local newspaper in New Jersey, actually.
That's kind of fitting. Yeah, go ahead.
When the first ship of child refugees arrived in 1934. And if more people knew about it, it would have jeopardized the program, because there would have been political backlash against it in all sorts of ways. So typically when she ended up splashed across the headlines, it was like a resolution to impeach her or a conspiracy theory that she was Jewish. Yeah. She cared a lot about the work, and she eventually got some credit. I mean, there were all sorts of congratulatory letters in 1933 when she became the first woman in the cabinet. And then the woman behind the New Deal in 2009 brought a lot of attention to Frances Perkins, and so did the establishment of the Frances Perkins Center in Maine, also around 2009. I argue in the final chapter of my book that for a historical figure to rise in the collective consciousness, they need both a compelling story and an institutional home base. Since 2009, Frances Perkins has had that. So it's not that she's never had attention, but my answer to your question about what surprised me, I think, is the extent to which she kept her head down Whereas I'm like, if someone does something annoying at work, I need to like tell someone else. Like, I'm not going to keep it to myself.
Yeah.
But she kept extraordinary things to herself.
So you are a remarkable scholar of U.S. history. One of the aspects of the book that I love, because this is where my mind is, are some of the pop culture references. And now you've said you're not a particularly ingrained in pop culture, but can you explain for the people who haven't read it yet, how in the world Dirty Dancing, the 1987 Patrick Swayze, Jennifer Grey classic, worked its way into your book?
First-year students at Mount Holyoke during orientation week sit through Dirty Dancing. It's called Dirty Dancing Under the Stars, and it's a big movie screen out on the amphitheater. And everyone cheers twice. The first time is, of course, when the protagonist says, or no, it's not the protagonist, it's her dad says, baby's going to Mount Holyoke in the fall. You know, everyone's like, woo. And the second time is when, I couldn't even tell you I'm not a movie person. I don't sit still for that long. But baby's love interest in the movie asks her, what's your real name, baby? And she says, Frances, after the first woman in the cabinet. Frances Perkins, Mount Holyoke class of 1902. Everyone goes, woo. And that is the origin of that reference. It also actually fits into the broader story of remembering Frances Perkins or of not remembering her. Because when that movie came out in 1987, people who were good at American history trivia might know that Frances Perkins is the first woman in the cabinet, but they don't know that her professional education was by volunteering in settlement homes, and that she was a point of connection between broader movements and different strands of social movements.
I love it. I'm not going to tell you, by the way, how old I was when I saw that movie, but I did see Dirty Dancing in the theater. In conjunction with all of your American history work, your next book is dealing with the American Revolution, but in sort of a unique way. Do you want to talk a little bit about this upcoming project?
I'm currently writing a book on historical memory of the American Revolution from the bicentennial through the semi-quincentennial through a female millennial lens. And my full-time job now is I'm working on Brown University's campus-wide initiative to mark 250 years of American democracy. So that's one way that I got to this project. I mean, that's one way I have time to work on this project. But for me personally, there actually is a point of transition, which is when I was writing about the historical memory of the sounds of music, I was having... because Frances Perkins aided the immigration of the Von Trapp family singers, I was having, like text conversations with various friends about their impressions of the Von Trapp's escape from Nazi-occupied Austria, or Nazi-annexed Austria. And I liked that kind of argument. I like analyzing what I learned as in my childhood that was wrong, and not only playing, I'm not interested in playing historian cop, as they call it, of like, this is wrong. It's more like, what was the motive for portraying that differently? And when you analyze that, what's really at the heart of it? That's the kind of analysis that I'm pretty obsessed with right now.
That sounds fascinating. So any rough estimate as when that might be coming out?
Let's see. It will be going on submission to publishers in early 2026.
Okay.
So if somebody wants it, then maybe 2 years after that.
Well, I can't imagine someone not wanting it. And certainly this work is fantastic. I know you've done a pretty significant 6-month-long, roughly, book tour, right? Was it
January to July, I was very privileged to do over 40 talks in 17 states.
That's fantastic.
I'm thrilled to be back in Morristown.
Yeah. And yes, because you did make a New Jersey stop.
I was in Montclair.
And you made it, and correct me if I didn't hear you earlier, you did make it out to Alaska, correct?
So that was actually before the book came out.
Okay.
It was between when I submitted the manuscript and when the book was published. I presented the Alaska chapter at the annual meeting of the Alaska Historical Society in October 2024. It was super fun. At my academic history conferences, we all kind of bumble around talking about history or whatever. But in Alaska, this stuff wasn't in walking distance, so there was like a van without seats, and we'd all just like pile into the van, and the designated driver drove us around. So the only topic in Alaska history I've ever researched directly was the King-Havner Bill. I hope that I fall into something else, maybe Alaskan postal history, because the Alaska Historical Society is a great community.
That's fantastic. That's very, very cool. And it should be noted that you and I do have something in common. We are both native Rhode Islanders, very proud of our beloved little home state. And you made 8 different stops, correct, in Rhody?
Something like that. A few bookstores, a few synagogues, my employer, Brown.
Listen, it is the most beautiful state in America, also the most rebellious state in America. We have been Rogues Island. I mean, Rhody has quite the history.
So Brown 2026 hosted Ken Burns last week, and somebody who works for Ken Burns must have spent a lot of time cutting and pasting together the Rhode Island clips from the 12-hour American Revolution documentary. Mm-hmm. It was so impressive how they included all of the Rhode Island. It was like they came in knowing that Rhode Islanders want to hear about the Gatsby. Rhode Islanders want to be shamed for being the last to ratify the Constitution. Because who doesn't want to be special?
We were just discerning. That's all. I mean, we weren't going to be... we weren't going to give it to peer pressure to sign the Constitution. We're going to take our time. And there's also a huge Rhode Island section in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. They follow...
Again, I'm not really a pop culture person. I can't sit for that long.
They follow a young Rhode Island soldier who survived all 4 years of the Civil War, because Rhode Islanders are tough. So, but this is an amazing, amazing book. It makes me incredibly happy to hear about the success that you've had with it, the tour that you've been able to do. We look forward very, very much to your next project. But for anyone who is intrigued by America of the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration, the power of Frances Perkins, immigration, there's anti-Semitism, there's so much wrapped up in this text, and what I give you extraordinary credit for is that it is a book that flows extremely well. It is a book that is easy to read. You gain something new on every single page, but it is a text that really flows like a movie. I know you're not a movie person. I am, and as I read this, it really felt like I was reading this remarkable screenplay of this incredible person's life. And Frances Perkins is someone who deserved a spotlight, and you have done a truly brilliant job on honoring her the way she deserves. And thank you so much for your effort, for this text, and thank you for being here with us. It is an honor to host you here at St. Elizabeth University, and we look forward to seeing more of your work and reading everything that you do.
Thank you for reading Dear Miss Perkins, and thank you so much for your work here and for including me in it.
This is The Cover, ladies and gentlemen. Find the book everywhere that you could buy books. This is a book you should own. Thank you very, very much again, and thank you all for listening. Have a great day.